So I was originally going to wait for the next Derek After Dark to display my new background, but when I saw this video from Allan Lichtman, there was a change in plans. For the three of you not in the know, there was a presidential election in the United States between Democrat Kamala Harris and Republican Donald Trump, the latter of whom won. A lot of people were surprised by the result, one of the most notable being Allan Lichtman, a presidential historian and professor at American University. Ordinarily, one's election prediction being wrong is not a big deal, but Lichtman's is a major exception. Back in the 1980s, he developed a model for predicting presidential elections called the 13 Keys to the White House. Starting from 1984, the model had a nearly perfect track record until 2024, where, for the first time, Lichtman's model indisputably failed. While Lichtman acknowledges his failure to predict the election, he has repeatedly made the claim that mainstream election predictors did just as bad of a job or worse. In one of his most recent videos, Were the 2024 Polls Accurate?, he argues that opinion polls are not effective means to predict elections. Now I step in to provide my own thoughts. Now before we start, I would like to say something to Professor Lichtman. This video is not meant as a personal attack against you. I'm aware that you've been getting a lot of harsh words thrown your way, many of them not being particularly constructive. I admit I'll have a little fun at your expense, but my primary motivation is to provide counter-arguments to the things you say, as I think you're quite ignorant when it comes to a lot of things, unfortunately. With all that out of the way, roll the intro.
Hello, friends.
Hello.
Today I'm going to talk to you about the horse race polls. As you know, this is something I've been commenting on for some time. But today I'm going to take a really deep dive into these kinds of polls. As you know, the Keys, I would say for the first time, missed the 2024 election. But the polls also missed this election, just as they have missed most of the important elections over the last few years.
While I'm going to talk about the errors in the polls, I'm going to take a much deeper dive. I'm going to talk about the dire implications of modern polling for our politics and our democracy. I'm not taking aim at the pollsters themselves. I'm sure they're doing as good a job as they possibly can. The problem is indeed symptomatic.
We'll see if you keep your word on that.
So let's take a look at the polls. In 2016, the polls missed the Trump win. In fact, the most eminent compiler of polls, the Princeton University Consortium from one of the world's great universities, gave Clinton a 99% chance of winning.
There's a lot to go over here. Regarding polls missing the election, I'm not sure if you're referring to national polls or state polls. You're wrong either way though, so let's go through both. If you're talking about national polls, here's the RealClearPolitics nationwide polling average for the 2016 presidential election. The polling average showed Hillary Clinton with a 3% lead over Donald Trump. And in the election, she beat Trump in the popular vote by 2 percentage points. An acceptable margin of error for opinion polls is 3.5% for each candidate, meaning that even a 7-point lead could actually be a tied race if the leading candidate underperforms and the trailing candidate overperforms by 3.5 points. As we can see, Hillary Clinton overperformed her polls by 1.4%, and Trump overperformed his polls by 2.5%, both of which are within the acceptable margin of error. Additionally, elections are not decided by the popular vote, so Hillary Clinton being ahead of Trump by 3% doesn't even mean much when you take into consideration that she can win the popular vote and still lose the election, as she did. If you're referring to state polls, here's RealClear's statewide polling averages for the 2016 election. Most of the swing states had completely acceptable polls, including Arizona, Colorado, Florida, Georgia, Maine, Nevada, New Hampshire, New Mexico, North Carolina, Oregon, Pennsylvania, and Virginia. Not only were these polls within the typical margin of error for opinion polling, several of them actually underestimated Hillary Clinton's strength in the swing states. Now, to be fair, there are some states in which the polls missed by a greater margin than the typically accepted 3.5%, such as Iowa, Michigan, Ohio, and Wisconsin. All of these polls underestimated Trump by a pretty substantial margin. However, notice that in these polls, there are a huge number of undecided voters. More undecided voters means a greater margin of error than typically expected, since those voters are still going to back someone at the ballot box. In fact, in most of these races, both candidates were underestimated. Also, the Princeton University Consortium is absolutely not the most eminent compiler of polls in the world, even back in 2016. That honor would probably go to either RealClearPolitics or 538. The former declared that the race was a toss-up, and the latter gave Trump almost a 30% chance of winning the election, much higher than the chance Princeton gave him. Nate Silver, the founder and at the time owner of 538, even said shortly before the election that while Clinton was favored to win, Trump could still pull off a victory due to how small Clinton's lead was in the polls, how many undecided voters there were heading into Election Day, and how the Electoral College favored Trump. Yes, Princeton got caught off guard, but most other polling aggregators did not.
But look at 2024. The polls gave no indication that Trump would sweep the popular vote and sweep all 7 swing states, not by a very small margin in most cases.
Okay, let's go into another tangent. 2024 had far fewer swing states compared to 2016, so let's look at the 7 commonly cited states: Arizona, Nevada, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, and Georgia. I'll cite 538's numbers because they're the most famous polling aggregator. The polls indicated that Trump sweeping all of the swing states was certainly possible. He was already ahead in the states of Arizona, Nevada, North Carolina, and Georgia, and the 3 states he was behind in did not have him down by a significant margin over Harris. You also claim that Trump swept the popular vote both nationwide and in the Electoral College, which isn't the case. Not all the votes have been counted nationwide, but Trump currently has won the popular vote by 1.6%. That's hardly what I would call a sweep. Most of the states were won by similarly narrow margins. Wisconsin, Trump won by 0.8. Michigan, Trump won by 1.4. Pennsylvania, Trump won by 1.7. Georgia, Trump won by 2.2. Now, 3 of the swing states had Trump winning by larger margins, those being a 3.2 win in North Carolina, a 3.1 win in Nevada, and a 5.5 win in Arizona. However, these states were already leaning towards Trump in the polling, so a typical error in Trump's favor would result in a win by those margins. These results are not particularly shocking to anybody looking at the polls.
Now, the pollsters have said, well, we told you the polls are within the margin of error, so we're not really wrong. Think about that. Basically, they're saying the polls are useless. They're noise. They don't tell you anything because they're all within the margin of error.
Polls being within the margin of error absolutely does not make them useless. Firstly, there's value in knowing that either candidate could win an election. In 2024, there was a Senate race in Wyoming in which the Republican candidate had an over 99% chance of winning according to polls-based forecasts. There was another race in Ohio this same year in which the Republican candidate had only a 59% chance of pulling off a victory. If you were in charge of Republican Party finances, which candidate would you give your money towards? Obviously the candidate in Ohio, since the polls indicate that they have a greater chance of losing their race. If a poll is within the margin of error, that indicates which elections are more important. Additionally, even when polls are within the margin of error, they can still tell us a lot about the chances a certain candidate will win. Of the major swing states, Arizona leaned the most towards Trump, with him leading by 2.1% according to polls. In Nevada, Trump also led, but only by 0.3%. This means that Kamala Harris would need to overperform her polls by a wider margin in order to defeat Trump in Arizona than she would in Nevada. This is reflected in the 538 forecast, where Kamala has a 50% chance to win Nevada, but only a 33% chance to win Arizona. She could win both, but one will be easier than the other.
Yet the media jumps on the polls as though, they were gospel, a 1 or 2 point swing, which is well within the margin of error. They trumpet the fact, oh, Trump has leaped ahead, or Harris has leaped ahead. So essentially, we have meaningless polls.
While I can agree that media talking heads, especially on cable news, have a bad tendency to look at individual polls and declare their preferred candidate is ahead, this does not mean that polls are useless, as stated in my previous interjection.
Moreover, think about this. What are the odds that just randomly, because of the margins of error, the national popular vote would go to Trump? Remember, the pollsters had consistently the popular vote favoring Harris throughout the campaign by as much as 3 points.
Pollsters were not consistently showing Harris with a popular vote lead. Atlas Intel gave Trump a 1-point lead in their final poll of 2024. TIPP Insights had Trump and Harris tied, but Trump gained a 1-point lead when third-party candidates were included as options. NBC News had the same results as TIPP. Kaplan gave Trump a 1-point lead, as did SoCal Strategies. YouGov showed the race as a tie. To be fair, in the polling averages, Kamala did lead Trump by an average of 1.2 points, but no pollster or forecaster in their right mind would have told you that this meant Harris was assured a popular vote victory.
And what were the odds that all 7 of the swing states would go to Trump? Remember, the polls had some favoring Harris, some favoring Trump, and some dead even. I'll tell you this, the odds from random error of all 7 swing states and the popular vote going for Donald Trump is a bit like rolling 8 heads in a row or 8 tails in a row from a fair coin. The odds are 1 in 256, very close to zero.
First off, your analogy already fails because most of the swing states were not 50-50 contests. The only states where both candidates had an even shot of winning were Pennsylvania and Nevada. Trump had a 59% chance to win North Carolina, a 60% chance to win Georgia, and a 67% chance to win Arizona. Kamala had a 59% chance to win Wisconsin and a 61% chance to win Michigan. However, there are deeper issues with your point. Looking at the odds that each candidate has in certain states and assuming that they are all separate from each other is actually a beginner mistake in election forecasting. This is because polling errors between states are highly correlated. In other words, when a candidate overperforms the polls in one state, they are likely to overperform the polls by similar amounts in other states. 538 has a really cool chart called the snake chart that demonstrates what I'm talking about. Think of the states as dominoes for a certain candidate to achieve a political victory. If Trump wins Michigan, then he'll likely have won Wisconsin. If Kamala does not win Pennsylvania, then she'll likely not win Arizona either. When you see a statistic like in New Mexico, where Donald Trump had a 12% chance to defeat Kamala Harris, this stat means 12% is the likelihood that Trump overperforms the polls enough to flip New Mexico red. The likelihood that one of the candidates would sweep all 7 of the states was actually quite high. Let's look at the polling averages for the swing states again. For Donald Trump to win all 7 of the swing states, he would only have to overperform the polls by 1%. That's not much at all. And yes, there were people in mainstream media who talked about this as well. Here's an article from the Washington Post that explains exactly what I'm saying. Here's an article from the New York Times that does this too. Here's an article from 538 that says the same thing. Either candidate sweeping all of the swing states was treated as a realistic outcome. So what were the odds that Trump would overperform the polls enough to sweep all 7 swing states? Of the swing states, Michigan was the most pro-Kamala, and Trump's chances of winning there were 39%. This means that Trump's chances of winning all 7 swing states was roughly 39% as well, which are pretty serious odds. And most importantly, those odds are much higher than the 0.4% chance that Lichtman claimed the pollsters gave Trump of doing this. That dumbass comment is the main reason I decided to make this video. It's the type of statement that, once said, exposes one's ignorance on a particular subject. Lichtman does not understand how to engage with models like this, probably because his preferred models are more gimmicky and less number-oriented. Before I end this interjection, I want to quash a potential counter-argument to all this. If polling error tends to go in one direction, then how did the 2016 polls underestimate Clinton in certain states? The simple answer is that there were more undecided than third-party voters in 2016. According to polling aggregator Nate Silver, historically, when there are more people voting for third parties or unsure of who they'll vote for, then there's less consistency with the polling errors between states. And most importantly, you don't roll coins, you flip them.
And the horse race pollsters have never acknowledged that.
Because that's not true.
Now, here is something really important. This goes very deep to something that I've called the political industrial complex, which has an incredibly pernicious effect on our politics and our democracy, but, has the media and the politicians in its grasp.
Quite an interesting theory, Mr. Lichtman. I hope he can provide some evidence for it, though. I'm skipping ahead a little bit because he talks about his Ground News sponsorship for the next 2 minutes, and I know you guys don't want to hear that. Also, this next segment is going to be quite long, so sorry for that. I want to let Lichtman explain his idea before I argue against it.
Now, remember I referred to the pernicious effect of the political industrial complex. In 1961, President Dwight Eisenhower, a man who knew and understood war, warned against the grip of the military-industrial complex on American life. He said that this complex was sustained by an iron triangle of the munitions makers, the military, and the politicians who wanted military contracts in their states and their districts. I have developed the idea of the political industrial complex, which is sustained by its own iron triangle that perpetuates the idea of an election being like a horse race, with candidates sprinting ahead or falling behind, according to the day-to-day events of the campaign, with the pollsters keeping accurate score.
At one point on the iron triangle are the pollsters, the ad men, the hucksters.
Remember when he said he wasn't going to dig at the pollsters? Yeah, me neither.
From this horse race theory. Then there is the media, who has to cover the election every single day, so buys into the horse race theory scored by the pollsters. Then there are the politicians who are afraid to go against the media, the hucksters, the ad men, the pollsters, and the consultants, because politicians tend to be risk averse.
Politicians don't go after the media? Maybe when you developed this model in the 1980s that was the case, but it certainly isn't now. Donald Trump, the guy who just won the election, is a great example of this. Look at all these times that he's bashed the media.
What a stupid question that is.
I told you when she was appointed.
You're a third-rate reporter, and what you just said is a disgrace, okay?
I would like for you to answer the question.
Okay, it's very simple to answer.
That's why I asked it.
It's very simple to, you're a nasty person.
Since you are attacking our news organization, can you give us a chance?
Your organization
You are
is
attacking
terrible.
our news.
And he's not the only politician in America to challenge the media either.
The media is not so interested in the serious issues facing this country.
I think the destructive, vicious, negative nature of much of the news media makes it harder to govern this country.
This morning you said the president trafficked.
What is wrong with you?
And politicians going against pollsters? That's happened too. Donald Trump literally called for a federal investigation into Jan Selzer after she published a poll that had him losing to Kamala in Iowa. Back when he was still running, Joe Biden also denied that the polls were providing an accurate assessment of the race, asserting that he was far ahead of Trump despite what the polls said. Your theory relies on the idea that these groups reinforce what the others are saying, but with politicians, they frequently deny the things that the media and pollsters say about them.
This iron triangle, sustained by the polls and the media and those who benefit from it, has two pernicious effects on our politics and our democracy. First of all, the horse race polling theory of elections promotes today's trivial, soundbite-driven, negative, essentially meaningless kinds of campaigns.
Polling is not responsible for a decline in good political discourse in the US. The modern-day election poll has its origins in 1936 with Gallup, and you implied this decline started recently.
If we could break that triangle, we could have a very different kind of campaign where candidates talk about substance and vision, which would be great for winning candidates because they would then have a mandate for enacting their agenda.
Winning candidates already have a mandate for enacting their agenda. You know, because they won the election.
And even losing candidates, if they campaigned in that way, rather than conventionally, would leave their mark on the country.
Plenty of losing candidates did leave their mark on the country, though. Even ignoring candidates who lost their initial elections and then went on to win later ones, I can still name several losing presidential candidates whose ideas became influential in American politics. Barry Goldwater lost the 1964 election to Lyndon Johnson, but Goldwater's conservative beliefs eventually became mainstream in the Republican Party. William Jennings Bryan lost 3 different elections, but his ideas laid the groundwork for the American progressive movement. Winfield Scott lost the 1852 election to Franklin Pierce because of his anti-slavery views, but a little over a decade later, slavery would be abolished in the United States.
Nobody remembers what conventional campaigners ever had to say except for a few gaffes. Who remembers what candidates had to say like Hillary Clinton, Mitt Romney, John McCain, John Kerry?
I love that he has to stop himself from saying Al Gore because he never acknowledged that Bush won in 2000.
Nobody remembers anything they had to say, and their campaigns become meaningless footnotes to history.
I mean, is that really a big deal? Some politicians' ideas just don't catch on, and people cease to talk about them outside of the one election they lost. Sorry that we don't spend enough time talking about Horatio Seymour or Alton Parker as much as you'd like, but they didn't do much worthy of comment beyond losing their elections. If Bob Dole and John Kerry meet the same fate, then who cares? Sorry if you happen to be partial towards them, but they had their shot to make their mark and they blew it.
On the other hand, even some major losing candidates have made their mark on history through their forthright, principled, substantive campaigns. Barry Goldwater in 1964 was swamped in a landslide by Lyndon Johnson, but his expression of conservative principles has influenced conservatives right through our own time. You could say the same thing about liberalism for George McGovern, who was swamped by Richard Nixon in 1972.
Well, good for McGovern and Goldwater. However, a lot of losing presidential candidates didn't run on new ideas. Adlai Stevenson ran in the 1952 election promising to continue the policies of the Truman administration, and he was defeated by Dwight Eisenhower. Hubert Humphrey pledged to continue Lyndon Johnson's policies if he won the 1968 election. Then he lost to Richard Nixon. These individuals' ideas for the future of the country are not remembered because they didn't have any new ideas for the country. Yet you make this assumption that they did.
The other way in which this iron triangle has a pernicious effect on our democracy is that it focuses on the polls, which for the most part are absolutely meaningless. Now, that may seem harmless, good fun, sports talk radio, but it's not, because it sacrifices coverage of the media telling us the truth in this age of immense disinformation. The media has copped out on that, and it sacrifices the media providing information on the real consequences of elections.
This is more of a subjective disagreement, so take it with a grain of salt if you wish. While I agree that the media has a problem with inaccurate reporting issues, I don't think the reason they have this problem is because they just spend so much time talking about polls that they can't check their information on other stuff. I think it's more likely that mainstream media outlets are worried about reporting on facts that challenge the worldviews of their audiences. Look at the Fox News versus Dominion lawsuit. Fox News broadcasted false claims that Dominion rigged their voting machines to steal the 2020 election for Joe Biden. The reason they did this was not because they spent so much time talking about polls that they couldn't dive deeper to investigate these facts. Fox's brain room, their fact-checking department, repeatedly told them there was no evidence of voting machines adding fake votes. They did this because they were losing viewership to outlets like Newsmax, who are more brazen in their election denial, and they felt that they had to air these claims to hold on to their audience. The problem is audience oversensitivity.
The media spends vastly more time on empty, meaningless polls within the iron triangle as opposed to telling truth to power and explaining to the American people what an election really means. And that is a tragedy for our politics and our democracy. You know, again, I'm not attacking personally the pollsters.
Except when you lump them in with hucksters. After this, he proceeds to talk about a fantasy of his in which the pollsters spend one election chilling on an island during the campaign period, which is not super relevant to any of my points, so I'll put down some concluding thoughts. Allan, you're a pretty smart guy. I actually watched quite a few of your streams in the lead up to this election, and I genuinely learned a lot about the history of American politics through your videos, but your intense bias against polls hurt the accuracy of this one in particular. Throughout this video, you make it clear that you're ignorant about how polls-based forecasts operate, probably because your bias tells you that they're worthless, so you never even tried to understand them. You should try to go into election discussions with a more open mind. Your argument about the media-industrial complex is laughable, requiring that I deny the interactions that I see all the time between politicians, pollsters, and media talking heads. Also, stop dragging down other people with you. While I'm glad to see you taking responsibility for a wrong prediction, you always feel the need to qualify it with, but everyone else got it just as wrong as I did, so it wasn't that bad, when other people did not get their predictions just as wrong as you did. This election has certainly dealt a big blow to your reputation, but I still think you can recover from it. Regardless of whether or not you take my advice, the ball's in your court now.